Officer down! I repeat, officer down!
Welcome back to 1033. This is your host, Nathan Kapler, a podcast created for a first responder by a first responder. If you are not a first responder, you still are welcome. This podcast is aimed directly at trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is complex and often misunderstood. Our brave men and women who serve our communities often end up with behavioral and psychological issues as a result of experienced trauma from their careers. My goal is to share what I know, my personal experience with PTSD as a retired police officer, and continue to advocate for mental health while providing support to those still in their careers. This podcast is not a substitute for professional medical help, and I strongly suggest if you are in fact suffering, you seek out professional medical advice. Please join me on this episode as I continue to expose the reality of PTSD challenges. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. We left off last week with my return to work in 2018 after about a year off on paternity leave. During that time off, my post-traumatic stress and my symptoms had decreased significantly. Despite my post-traumatic stress and the symptoms as they were decreasing now from experiencing less stress and being in a much different environment, upon my return to work, I was now faced with increased stress, and a lot of those symptoms that had now diminished were actually returning. I was initially rocked with disbelief that over the year off with my daughter and the work that I had poured into myself to manage my own stress and try to get to a better place of healing, all of that effort, all of that hard work was instantly met with this idea of being instantly negated upon my return to work and now having had to face panic attacks all over again. And they were growing once more. I would describe my return to work as anything but smooth. The unnecessary roadblocks that existed upon my return to work, I do actually believe helped trigger some of that anxiety, some of those symptoms that I had just dealt with. The complete lack of support upon my return to work did not help whatsoever. I don't blame the RCMP for this. But I do talk about it because it needs to be spoken about. I know for a fact that I will not be the last person that experiences this. And that if we can aim to grow from my experience and enhance the process, why would we not talk about it? And just to paint a picture of the way the RCMP is moving, and I do applaud them for this, I recently connected with someone who has specific insight into return to work. And they are actively engaged in ensuring that employees, as they return to work, for whatever the reason is, whether they were off for maternity or paternity leave, whether it was stress leave, a medical concern, it doesn't matter why they went off. But if they went off for a prolonged period of time, they need help to come back into the workplace. And I do believe the RCMP is trying to shift their approach on this to offer support. I do hope that they are starting to recognize that a lack of support does not bode well for their people. Do I wish that those supports existed in place for me when I returned to work in 2018? Absolutely, I do. But I also do not live in the past. What happened, happened. We cannot live in the past. And this is one of the best lessons I have learned with post-traumatic stress, is that you have to eventually dust yourself off and continue to move forward. Always honor your journey, and if you are in this place right now where you're feeling unsupported at work, it might be time to take a deeper look at that, reflect on that just a bit more, to see what it is that you need. Your relationships with people, your employer, everything that you take part of in life has an impact to you, positive and negative. Always be alive to what you are receiving and what you are involved with, because there is always a cost to everything you do in your life. Despite the advice that comes from my own journey, a few weeks into my return to work, we were met with some fairly significant operational requirements, some needs that were required of our people. At that time, there was a G8 event that was going to be happening in Quebec, I believe. And as I had just had a child, I felt that I was unable to leave BC at that time to go and meet those operational needs. I can remember around that time, our entire floor of police officers was pulled into a meeting, and we were all told that we were all going. Now, I understand this tone, that sometimes the RCMP has to take this stance. But in those moments, some very valid questions were raised by officers, as in how do we get support so that if we're going to leave home for a prolonged period of time, how do we continue to support our families? A lot of those concerns were not met in any kind of compassionate or supportive way. I specifically raised one question to this effect. And I was met with an answer that was completely insensitive, unsupportive, and had a complete lack of regard for where I stood in my own life in that moment as a new father and some of the challenges that I now faced as a new father. I had given so much of myself to the RCMP over the years, and now as a father with a daughter at home and a wife who was also challenged and navigating this new world of new motherhood, my supports needed to be at home. After the conclusion of that meeting, following that meeting, I had met with my supervisor and just let them know that I felt that I could not service this requirement. I could not go to Quebec for 2 to 4 weeks, whatever the case was, and that my needs consisted now as a new father to be at home. That supervisor was supportive in this belief. They knew where I stood in life and what I had just went through with the birth of my child, and understood some of the struggles that come with now trying to place a solid foundation at home for your child, for your wife, for the family, and for yourself, all while trying to maintain a career and be actively engaged and fully supportive of the needs of that career. Work continued on for a short while through that month, but near the end of April, the anxiety and the panic attacks had actually grown to a point where they were now debilitating, and they were actually recognized at work by others. They may not have totally known what I was going through in that moment, but in those moments, I was completely incapacitated at my desk with panic attacks. And near the end of April was when I experienced my most severe debilitating panic attack. The attacks now were being triggered with no stimulus around me. I was seated at my desk at one point, typing up a report on my computer, when all of a sudden I could feel my vision again constrict. I knew what this felt like. I knew what was happening in this moment. But as my vision continued to restrict and pan from 180 degrees to the very pinpoint location directly in front of me on my computer screen, all I could see was a small area about the size of a coin on my computer. And the text that was behind that as I was typing, I couldn't even read that anymore. I no longer could hear the hum or the drum or the voices around me as people worked and connected and talked about certain things that were going on in the environment. It was as if someone had taken the volume knob for my hearing and slowly turned it down. And while that volume was being drowned out, I then began to experience a heightened ringing in both of my ears, and that was now turning up and getting louder and louder. My body became instantly hot. A heat grew from the inside of my stomach and grew to a point where it moved beyond the stomach into the chest, into the arms, into the legs, into the neck, even in the head, and pressure as well seemed to accompany this sensation. With the heat, my body now began to perspire, and my palms suddenly now were dripping wet, almost as if the anxiety was screaming out of my hands, as my body was trying to expel what it was experiencing in that moment. Nausea was also brewing within. I now started to actually feel queasy at the same time, like my stomach was upset or unsettled. Despite feeling all of these sensations, I actually had become fairly accustomed to how they felt. And as I was trying to talk myself down in that moment, to try and calm myself down, to remind myself that I was okay and that I was safe, nothing was working. The severity of the attack itself was continuing to grow. This time was different for me. I now experienced something in my heart, and I could feel my heart begin to constrict and almost change its rhythm. It was pounding fiercely, but it didn't seem to have a normal rhythm, as I could feel it pounding in my chest. Across my chest now, it started to begin to feel like it was being constricted by an external force. Like someone was standing behind me, hugging me, squeezing me as hard as they could. And I felt an immense amount of pain in my chest. I had hoped in that moment that this was not a heart attack. I had hoped in that moment that I was not going to die. But I also knew in that moment that I had no idea where this panic attack was going. Was this a heart attack? Was this my final moment? I sat with myself for what felt like eternity. I felt lightheaded. I felt like I was going to pass out. And that at moments the darkness was definitely consuming me, and the body was now trying to shut down. Was it trying to do that as a safety mechanism for the stress that I was experiencing in that moment? I have no idea. I didn't lose consciousness, and I don't believe I experienced a heart attack, although it feels like this could have possibly been one, or maybe this is what one feels like. I have no idea. But the pain behind all of this was very real. In that moment, I knew I had to take a stand. I now had to take a stand for my health. I don't know how to describe this next thought that popped into my head in this moment, but as some of the symptoms seemed to ease, I again was able to have somewhat of a logical thought, although it probably wasn't logical whatsoever, as I was still very much in this reaction. And it was this idea of the canary in the coal mine, a belief that if I did not take action and honor what I had just been through, and truly address what was going on and stop running from these problems that had been building for years, I would end up dead from stress. I would have a heart attack at a very young age. I have no way of knowing how the body let me know this, but in my mind I knew that that was a point where I had to take action. As the body continued to decrease its reaction in this moment, the nausea continued to elevate, and I actually became sick, and I had to run to the washroom. And the body had expelled all of the contents that were in the stomach. I knew that I was leaving work now. I was not returning. I had packed up my stuff, and I had left. I had left it all behind. And as soon as I got outside and took a deep breath, I called my psychologist, and I scheduled an appointment for the following morning. And I said, we need to talk about stress leave. This is what I just went through. As I got into my car, I recognized that I could barely drive. I believe I actually sat in my car for about a half an hour while the body continued to reestablish itself and stabilize and deal with some of these symptoms and the feelings that I had just been through. I reached out to my supervisor and just let him know that I had experienced a panic attack, that it was serious, and that I was going home. I didn't feel well, and that I would reach out later. He too knew PTSD well. He had it himself. He understood how this stuff impacts the body. He was incredibly supportive in that moment. Now, despite some of the struggles that I faced in this moment, I always recognized that I would need to be open and honest about some of the things that I was experiencing. So I actually had called a meeting the very next day with my supervisor and a supervisor above him. And I met them in a coffee shop, and I was completely transparent as to what I had experienced on the previous workday, and said that now I am actively involved with my psychologist. We are going to be doing an immense amount of sessions. We are going to be trying to get ahead of this issue, but most likely I will be going on stress leave. The vulnerability that I needed to possess in that moment, I couldn't run from this anymore. What I had just experienced propelled me into confronting this head on. And as I talked to these two men about what I had experienced, I was met with nothing but compassion and understanding. I received full support to look after myself, my health, and to begin to deal with this journey into PTSD once and for all. Following that meeting, I met with a psychologist and we went over what I had experienced, and it was very clear in that moment that I was completely done. I could not take on anything more, and that stress leave was a very real option for me now. I needed to go home. I needed to be at home. I needed to be in a stress-free environment. The body needed this to heal. What I now recognize years after this point is the body was nudging me ever so gently and raising flags along the way, letting me know that this environment, being a police officer, had taken a toll to a point where I may need to step away for good. My time of service was done. There is an expiry date to men and women in their service life. You need to be very engaged and watch the body as to when your expiry date is. Some happen sooner than later, and there is no shame when you are finally met with your date. Now, in that moment, I didn't recognize this concept. I believed that I would be able to take the stress leave and deal with the body and help it get healthy once and for all and return to work. That was my hope the entire time as I was dealing with this head on. However, the cost of this most recent panic attack had left the body in such a state that I believe I was now faced with severe depression, anxiety, and my PTSD had now completely grown to a point where it was unmanageable. The pain that came from the body now reeling from this event, this sensation that I had just experienced at work, was so profound that medical cannabis now had been brought into my daily life while I was off, and was now being used as a tool to ensure that I didn't get sick at home. I didn't experience multiple panic attacks throughout the day. If I did nothing and I didn't take that medical cannabis, I would have experienced panic attacks throughout the day, consistently, in a state of depression and not being able to leave my bed. There is no shame behind depression in men. It's a very common thing. What I've learned about depression going through everything that I have had gone through now with this journey was that the body was now calling for a deep state of rest. After this last panic attack, it no longer could operate. It had experienced enough stress. It was completely overwhelmed, and it shut down. And it let me know that. For months on end, I was locked in my bed with no energy at all. I didn't feel sad. I just felt completely empty inside and numb. The lack of energy was so significant that there was actually moments as I would lay in bed, and I didn't know if I had energy to get up to go to the bathroom. The body needed rest so badly that it actually believed in those moments and promoted this idea that it would be easier just to stay in bed and relieve yourself than have to get up and go to the bathroom. That's how deep of a state of rest that the body was calling on me for. And I struggled for months in this position. But at the same time, this is exactly what the body needed. It needed to rest. I'm trying to recall what I experienced emotionally in those moments, and to be honest with you, I don't think there was any emotion. I don't even believe there was anger in that moment. I was completely empty on the inside. I had no emotion whatsoever. Numb to a point where I didn't care about life anymore. I didn't even know if I wanted to be alive anymore. And this is where suicidal ideation comes rushing in. First responders do take their lives. It is a hidden little fact within our world, and often goes unspoken, which I believe is the worst way to approach this topic. Now, I'm not going to dive into the world of suicide, not in this episode. That is something we can address much later, because it too deserves its own time. But in that moment, I believe it was about 6 months where I had been off, where I was actively engaged in going to see a psychologist and basically being at home in bed and resting. I was not capable of doing anything during the day. And there was an impact not only to me, but to my family as well. We all suffered as a result. I couldn't be there as a father or a husband, or even begin to try and take care of myself. I just existed in those moments, an empty vessel here in life, trying to find my way out. Now, in this painful place, this place of existence that I was in, I believe that relationship with medical cannabis at that time had shifted into something much more sinister. I don't believe in that moment I had recognized that the relationship had shifted towards addiction. But as I continued to use it to try and maintain the pain that I was going through daily, I inevitably started to build a tolerance to it. And as such, my consumption for it, or the need for more, grew. There still were positive impacts to the cannabis in those moments. It did help me to sleep. It did help to control the anxiety and the panic attacks and give me some positive feelings throughout the day in this state of complete depression. And you can start to see in that moment when I started to view it that way, that it then began to control me. And I was fighting a losing battle. As I continued to use this substance throughout the day and at night to help me manage what I was experiencing, it may have actually interrupted my own healing process. I acknowledge that. But in those moments, we usually are the last person to know where we stand in that moment with our relationship with a substance. I had completely closed off in those moments as well. I couldn't be social. I couldn't socially engage with anyone outside of my house. I wasn't leaving my home either. I don't even believe I was going out to do simple things such as grocery shop. I had completely stopped taking care of myself as well. And I had fallen into this relationship of trying to just manage the pain within. Now, this is a chapter in my life. This doesn't mean that my life still looks like this. I have had to fight to come back to sobriety. And that's where I am now. I am a success story. And I share this journey because I know that others go through this as well. You do not have to be a police officer to experience pain. There are many others that reach out to me daily, reminding me of where they stand in their own life. A lot are first responders. Some are not. Some are people with just trauma. And I don't say just trauma as in just trauma. But they don't have this compounding issue of the first responder environment behind them, the culture, and everything that exists within that workplace. What I've also recognized too in this journey is that substance abuse is incredibly common in first responders. That's my lived experience. Is it high also for civilians? I have no idea. But I know that first responders, being able to fall into this issue of substance abuse, I understand it because that was me. And the amount of incredibly difficult work that you need to then pour into yourself to get yourself well. That is the journey. As I continued on in my own journey around that time, others started to see that I was suffering. I could no longer hide this. Despite not being out and being social, family members in that inner circle knew that something was not well. These family members, some spoke up. Some had mentioned to me, "Are you okay?" Others didn't know how to approach this topic. And I don't hold guilt over that or shame on them or any type of regret that they should have stepped forward and let me know in that moment that I was suffering. There were people that told me. And the level of denial that happens when you are facing addiction or pain removes most of a chance that you may have to see the narrative of what's actually taking place, what your reality really looks like in that moment. Addiction is a disease. I truly believe that. And once we get far enough down into the road of addiction, it can become impossible to come back out of on your own. Over time, I also acknowledged too that my depression in time started to lift. I started to regain some of the energy that I now needed to do simple tasks. Shower, go to the bathroom, get the kids off to school. But now what was being replaced with that was there were immense amounts of moment in my journey where the level of cannabis that I was consuming was now actually forming what I believe was almost like a toxicity in the body. I was hungover. And I would use cannabis now to try and deal with that hangover, to be able to do things throughout the day at home. Now, this all took time to get to a place where I got to a point where I knew now that the problem that I was facing was different from PTSD. It was PTSD, yes, but it was also PTSD, depression, anxiety, and addiction. I knew in those moments I was not well. I could see it in myself when I looked at myself in the mirror. And it had taken time to get there. It had taken about a year. While off, trying to heal and deal with what I was facing, my experiences from work, the trauma from work. In early 2019, I had actually reached out to the RCMP. They were checking in with me every month to see how I was doing, which in moments was not completely welcome due to the state that I was in, but now I do look back and I do appreciate those efforts. It is good that they tried to stay engaged. But in 2019, I recognized that I was starting to face this bigger issue. And I started to reach out to the RCMP asking about getting help. I wasn't yet fully ready to admit the struggle that I was facing was addiction. But I had recognized in that moment that the trauma, the impact of trauma to me over those decades of policing was very real. I believe that if I didn't acknowledge the addiction in that moment and I dealt with the trauma, maybe I could be free of the addiction and I wouldn't really have to talk about it. And again, that's denial. Denial is such a creepy little thing that exists in us when we are not well and we are facing significant issues. The RCMP was very supportive of me going to a rehab facility that had a trauma-based program. It would take me some time to finally admit that I was ready to go, but I had started the process of engaging the RCMP and acknowledging that I did actually need legitimate help, more than just what I was getting. In the next episode, we will talk about my journey as we continue on into finally recognizing that I needed to put my hand up and ask for help. In the next episode, we will continue to explore this chapter into addiction and when I finally made the step to acknowledge that I needed to go to rehab, that I needed the help, that this issue now was beyond my control. In advance, I thank you for your support and I thank you for your care and compassion around this very real conversation, this very real topic. Thanks for tuning in. Much love. I hope you enjoyed this last episode. As we continue to grow, I would appreciate your support. Please consider subscribing to the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. Leave a comment or a review and share this with anyone that you may know may benefit from what we are discussing. Have a great week, and as always, thank you for tuning in.